Alright everyone, I'm going to look at a game that was played some time ago, 9 years ago in fact, Magnus Carlsen versus Hikaru Nakamura. So this was actually a clash of the titans in the Tata Steel Wijk in 2011. And it was quite a good game actually, and I think Magnus has also got a video on YouTube somewhere where he's going through it, but I thought I'd take a look. But I actually like going through some old games, you can learn a lot from them. So in this game, Magnus began with the move e4, Hikaru actually played c5, and then there was knight to f3, d6 and d4, so we're into a Sicilian, and Hikaru took on d4 and Magnus recaptured, with black playing knight to f6. Okay, this knight hits e4, Magnus defends with knight c3, and it's very important for black to play this move a6, because it covers the b5 square, stops the two knights from jumping into this key square, where it could cause black some issues. Now I've also highlighted typically here these two green squares because the bishop for white usually goes to e3 or g5 here, which is more of the main lines and more regularly played. But Magnus decided to go for this line with bishop to e2. So okay, white's just sensibly developing here, and black now plays e5, hits the knight on d4, forces it to move to b3. And we're into a Sicilian Najdorf, and now Hikaru played bishop to e7, developing his bishop. And Magnus goes in for a very interesting line. He plays bishop to e3, black castles, and now we get some interesting lines with g4. So the bishop and the queen supports this g4 pawn, so black can't capture it. And essentially white just wants to launch this h-pawn up and also this g-pawn, and eventually maybe even launch the f-pawn to attack the black king. Black has to remain active though. So if you're black king, you're thinking maybe h6 would be a good way to defend this. This is actually not a good idea, because now white can play h4, and after white plays g5 you have to react to it because you played h6. For instance, let's say knight to h7 here, white can continue with knight d5, that knight's dominating the centre. After bishop to e6, white can simply take this bishop off on e7, followed by queen takes, and now play g5. And this is the problem with playing h6. Now you have to meet this g5 move, you have to do something, you have to either push this pawn up, or you have to take the pawn on g5. And if h takes g5, white gets a really nice game. After takes, knight can recapture, but this is no problem for white because white just plays queen to d3, protects the e4 pawn, and white's plan is very simple, just do castle queenside, and probably dump a rook on the g-file, and then just launch these two rooks at this king. So two open files in front of the black king, you would not like to play against that. Right, so after g4 though, Hikaru continued with development. Bishop to e6 was played, Magnus played g5, attacking Hikaru's knight, which went to d7. The bishop and the queen have got a battery against g5 pawn, so h4 was played by Magnus to support his pawn, and black moved their knight to b6. Magnus also continued his development with queen to d2, preparing f4 and castles queenside. So both sides are basically developing. Black develops his last piece, his last minor piece anyway, to d7, and before castling though, Magnus inserts this move, f4. Quite a nice move, prepares f5, forcing the bishop to probably take this weak knight off on b3 in some lines. So, in the game Hikaru took on f4, f5 was also possible here. This was actually quite a decent move, but then will come takes on f5, bishop takes, probably castles queenside, and then if we continue with rook c8, white could take on e5, pawn takes, and then we get to bishop to d3, bishop to e6. And variation continues with moves like queen to e2. The best here is rook takes c3 for black, a typical idea in the Najdorf where black sacrifices in exchange for the knight. And the computer line gives bishop takes b6. Point being is if the knight takes, then in some lines there's a bishop takes h7 with the discovery with the rook against the queen. But after queen takes b6, white can just take on c3. After queen c7, king b1. It's quite an interesting position. Again, white's the exchange up. So you have to say white probably has the advantage, but it would be quite an interesting position if Hikaru had played f5 in this position. But in the game, he actually just took on f4, which I think makes a lot more sense. Magnus recaptured with his bishop. There was knight to e5, and finally Magnus completes his development with castling queenside, and Hikaru places his rook on the open c-file. So Magnus does the logical thing and sidesteps his king to b1 to get off the c-file. This is to aid the king, and in some lines maybe even play rook c1 to defend this c2 square. Queen c7 was played, so Hikaru's got a queen and rook battery coming up against the c-file. But Magnus continues his attack with h5. So it's a very double-edged position. This is often seen in Najdorf, where white's attacking on the king side and black's attacking on the queen side. So you get some very interesting games, and it's good fighting chess from both sides. So black played rook f to e8, and Magnus just hid his king in the corner with king to a1. Now it looked as though knight to c4 was a possibility for black, and if takes, he can recapture with the knight. And after queen to d3 to move the queen away from the knight, it looks quite interesting if black played a5 and tried to get on with the attack. But maybe Hikaru was worried about this move h6. Because after a move like g6, the g7 square becomes very weak. So it's very tough for black to defend this throughout the whole game. For instance, if white continued with knight to d4, I looked at a4, knight takes a4, queen a5, it gets quite double-edged. For instance, after knight to c3, bishop takes g5, takes, and queen to f3. The computer seems to like white, but again, it's quite a difficult position for both sides to play. You've got to be very accurate and very careful. So going back to the game, maybe this is why black didn't play knight to c4. Hikaru actually defended his position with bishop to f8, and this helps because it lets a queen cover the 7th rank, and also this bishop does a good job of covering g7 in some lines. But Magnus continued with knight to d4. So attacking the bishop on e6, so in some variations now, white is free to capture on e6. There was queen c5, and then Magnus went in for the kill now, and he's ready for his attack with g6. And this is a good move because if black takes this off, then obviously white will just recapture. And again, if black takes this off, let's say knight takes, then again white just gains a good open file with the rook. I don't think it's good in this particular variation. But if, for instance, now white took on e6, for instance, then rook takes and bishop g4, it looks as though white is doing incredibly well. You can play bishop to f5 at another moment in time and start harassing this h7 pawn with the rook and the bishop, for instance. That's just an example of what can occur. So after g6, again, if black takes this off and we take it and play h6, instead of taking on g6, again, white gets a good position after knight takes the bishop, rook takes on e5, and if rook takes e5 here, then queen f4 is just a very strong move with queen to f7 coming in, followed by rook sacrificing itself for h6. Because if you can see that far ahead, if let's say queen f7 check, king to h8, rook takes h6, pawn takes, and then at the end of it there's queen to h7 checkmate. So after this sort of a bishop takes e5, there has to be d takes e5, and then after bishop g4, white's just skewering the two rooks and will win material. So g6 by Magnus, very strong move, forces Hikaru to play knight to c4 to attack the queen. Bishop takes c4 was played, knight takes c4 again attacking the queen, and then there was queen to d3, keeping the queen centralised. And now Hikaru does take on g6, so the white squared bishop is now off. And after pawn takes, he plays h6. Again, you don't want to leave an open file for the rook on the h-file, so h6 is probably mandatory. But now Magnus plays a very accurate move, which is queen to g3, very calm and patient. In some lines he could play maybe queen to h4, maybe even prepare bishop takes h6 in some variation, and also it's not a nice battery against this pawn. Queen b6 was played then, threatening mates on b2. Bishop c1 was played to stop the checkmate, and Hikaru played queen to a5, and in some lines then maybe bishop and this queen are hooking up to try and checkmate the king on a2. I kind of think this, maybe Magnus should have played knight to e6 here. If captures, just play knight to d5. The point is this sort of sets a nice little trap, because after rook takes e4, Queen to f3 would be very nice, and there's no way to defend that f7 square against a check. So that would have been quite nice. However, Magnus just continued with rook to f1, gains the f-file, and in the game Hikaru now played knight to e5, getting his knight back into the centre, guarding this f7 square with the knight, attacking g6, makes a lot of sense. But I think white now gains the initiative, plays knight to d5, blocks the bishop on e6. Oh yeah, I should have said actually, the bishop and queen again hook up to attack this a2 square, so that makes sense why Magnus blocked it off. Black took, pawn takes, there was queen takes. So technically actually, black is actually a pawn up, but now we see a genius move by Magnus. Maybe pause the video and see what you would play as white here. But Magnus actually went for a good move. He played bishop takes h6, sacrificing his bishop. Hikaru took, and then there was g7, attacking the bishop on f8. If bishop takes the pawn, then play could just continue with knight to f5. If rook c7 to defend the bishop, then just knight takes h6 check, king h7, knight to g4 because the rook's attacking the king. King has to go backwards, and then there's knight to f6, family fork. The queen is pinning the bishop, so it can't take the knights. And yeah, black's just absolutely lost in that position. But after g7, there's bishop to e7, rook takes h6 from Magnus, threatening checkmate on h8. Knight f7 covers the square, but now he plays queen to g6, again threatening checkmate with queen h7. Hikaru is forced to take the rook off. Magnus recaptures with the queen. There's bishop to f6, so black's still in the game, just about flailing around here trying to defend the position. Sacrificing the bishop on f6. Nice little trick. If rook takes f6, then obviously rook to e1, queen c1 would be checkmate. So bishop f6 is crafty for the amateur player, but Magnus is never going to fall for that one. He played queen h8 in the game with check. King f7 is forced, and now white gets a queen with check. Black can take the queen off, but the point is now queen takes f6 is on the table. King e8 is the only move, and then comes rook to e1 with check, and Hikaru actually resigned the game here because the queen has to block the check, otherwise the only move is king to d7, and then queen to e7 is checkmate. So a very nicely played game by Magnus, played in the year 2011, so he would have been about 21 years old this time, arguably in the form of his life. And that was a great game by both players, by Magnus and Hikaru. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my analysis of the game. If you did, please do drop a like, comment or subscribe to the channel, it really helps. And hopefully I'll see you in the next video.